It wasn't the shove that made me understand. Not really. That came later. The moment that planted the first doubt was smaller, almost polite. Emily placed the teacup in front of me without the usual warmth, her hands too careful, her voice too level. "You look well," she said, as if it were a fact to be acknowledged, not a feeling to be shared. We were standing in my own kitchen. Her earrings were new, her blouse ironed crisp. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Something in me stiffened. Later that same morning, I was reaching for the broom when she brushed past me. It wasn't hard, but it was intentional, just enough to make me stumble. I caught myself on the edge of the counter. We locked eyes. She said nothing. I didn't say anything either. I was still trying to believe I had imagined it. But when I texted Aaron that evening, asking if he could come by, he didn't call back. No explanation. Just a message, short and final. "Don't come back. It's better this way." There was no fight. No pleading. Just silence on the line and the slow, quiet weight settling into my chest. I sat on the porch with the porch light off, watching the marsh beyond the fence turn silver under the moonlight. Something was wrong. Not just with her, but with him. And I needed to understand why. The wrist fracture happened on a Tuesday, sometime around mid-morning. I was out on the back porch refilling the bird feeders after a night of wind had knocked everything over. The steps were still damp from the rain, and when I turned too quickly, my foot slid. I grabbed for the railing but missed. Landed hard on my side with my left arm twisted beneath me. The pain was sharp, immediate. I didn't scream, just sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. The kind of breath that comes out more like a gasp than a cry. I couldn't stand up on my own. My phone had fallen from the pocket of my cardigan and slid down the last step into the mud. I was lucky. The neighbor's boy, Benji, who usually walks to school with his backpack half unzipped, had seen me fall through the slats in their fence. He ran for his mother, who called for help. I remember hearing her voice from the porch, calm but urgent, saying something about a possible break. At the hospital, the nurse helped me out of the jacket I'd managed to pull on with one arm. They x-rayed the wrist and confirmed the obvious. Clean fracture, radius and ulna. 6 weeks in a cast, followed by a few more with a brace. No surgery, just patience. The young doctor smiled as he handed me a printout of care instructions. "You'll need help with the usual stuff, groceries, laundry, making meals. Nothing you can't manage with a little support." That was the part that stayed with me, with a little support. I texted Aaron that night. Just a simple message. I told him I'd had a fall, broken my wrist, that I was home but a little sore and could use a hand if he had time later in the week. No response. The next morning, Emily showed up instead. She let herself in without knocking, holding a Tupperware dish with foil stretched tightly across the top and a manila folder tucked under her arm. "Aaron's tied up with work," she said, setting everything down on the kitchen counter. "I thought I'd bring this by." The casserole smelled like cumin and garlic. It was probably something trendy, quinoa and lentils, maybe, but I didn't ask. I thanked her and offered tea, but she declined. She stood in the kitchen like a guest who'd decided to act like a host. "So," she said, tapping the folder. "Aaron and I have found a place by the lake. 3 bedrooms, new floors, a little yard out back. It's perfect." I smiled politely. "That's wonderful news." She opened the folder. "The only hiccup is the mortgage. The lender prefers a cosigner. Not for the entire term, just to get us through approval." I looked at the paperwork. There were numbers I didn't recognize, terms I hadn't agreed to. My name was typed at the top of the document beside Aaron's. It was surreal, like seeing a stranger wearing my clothes. Emily continued, it's really just a formality. You have excellent credit, and Aaron's debt-to-income ratio is a little messy right now because of the student loans. It's temporary. 6 months, maybe a year. Then we'll refinance and remove your name. You'd never be liable for anything, I promise. I asked if Aaron had read the documents. She said yes. He trusts you, she added. We both do. I said I'd need time to look everything over. She smiled. Of course. We understand. Just let us know before the end of the week. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me. I didn't open it again. I just sat there, listening to the clock tick on the wall and the birds picking at seed outside the window. I ran my good hand across the table's edge, the one Henry had built 30 years ago. It still had a nick in the corner from when Aaron dropped his fork during a tantrum at age 5. It was the kind of mark you stop seeing after a while but remember instantly when your fingers pass over it. That night, I messaged Aaron again. Told him I'd like to talk in person. I mentioned the fall again. I told him about the wrist. The pain meds made me foggy, but I knew I had written it clearly. A few minutes later, a single text arrived. Don't come back. It's better this way. There was no context. No greeting. No mention of the injury. Just a decision. Clean, efficient, impersonal. I didn't respond. I reread it once, then set the phone down. That night I lay awake longer than usual, trying to make sense of his words, his silence. I replayed every moment of the past few months, birthdays skipped, calls unanswered, Emily's brief visits filled with compliments that somehow felt like corrections. It all started to look different. The next morning, I opened the mortgage website. I'd helped Aaron set it up years ago when he was applying for his first car loan and didn't know what half the buttons meant. Sure enough, the application was there. My name, scanned signature, financial information, all attached. But it hadn't been finalized. I still had time. I called the bank. The woman on the line was patient, asked for a few details, then confirmed that nothing had gone through yet. Would you like to withdraw your consent? She asked. Yes, I said. Immediately. She walked me through the steps. I clicked through the confirmation pages one by one, reading every word this time. It took 20 minutes. When I logged out, I felt something shift. Not relief, exactly. More like something solid returning to its proper place. That afternoon, I heard from Laura, Emily's younger sister. We hadn't spoken in months. She'd always been quiet at family gatherings, the kind of girl who refilled drinks and slipped out before dessert. I thought you knew, she wrote. Emily said you agreed to the mortgage weeks ago. She submitted the papers last month. I told her I hadn't signed anything. There was a pause in the conversation. Then another message came through. She also told Aaron she was pregnant. That's the only reason he pushed so hard for the house. I asked how she knew. She told me. I heard her. She laughed about it. The screenshots followed, texts between Emily and a friend, jokes about cravings, about Aaron falling for it. One message read, "As soon as we get the house, I'll have a miscarriage. He'll never know." I saved everything. I didn't call Aaron. I didn't forward the messages. Instead, I went upstairs to the safe where I kept the family documents and opened the trust Henry and I had set up before he passed. It had been written years ago, with the best of intentions. We'd wanted Aaron to be protected, no matter what. But intentions aren't the same as boundaries. That night, I rewrote the trust. Aaron would inherit only if he filed to annul the mortgage agreement, submitted proof of therapy or counseling, and initiated legal proceedings to challenge the signature forgery. If he refused, or if he continued the marriage under false pretenses, everything would be reassigned to Laura, the only one who had the decency to speak the truth aloud. I had the new documents notarized the next morning. Then I wrote a letter. I placed it in the envelope with the amended trust and gave it to Connie, the lawyer I'd known since Henry passed. "Only give this to Aaron if he asks for it," I said. "Not before." She looked at me with a kind of quiet respect. "Are you sure?" "I am." When I left her office, I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. The days that followed were quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet I used to enjoy on Sunday mornings, but a tense stillness, like a house holding its breath before a storm. No calls came from Aaron. No texts. Emily didn't come back to the house. Laura checked in once, asking if I was all right, but I could tell she was hesitant. Maybe unsure what she'd stepped into. I spent that week sorting drawers. It helped to put my hands on something solid: buttons, old recipe cards, safety pins, batteries I didn't remember buying. I reorganized the pantry, moved the dried beans and cans to the lower shelves where I could reach them more easily with one arm. It was slow work, but it filled the hours. On Thursday, I found the pendant. Henry had given it to me on our 20th anniversary. Emerald, not large but beautifully cut, set in a silver frame that he'd designed himself and had made by a jeweler in Savannah. He called it modest. I called it perfect. I kept it in a velvet pouch inside my dresser. When Aaron was little, he used to sneak in and play with my necklaces, lining them up like soldiers on the floor. I'd scold him gently, but I never moved the pendant. It stayed in its pouch unless I wore it, which was rare. Now, it was gone. I searched the drawer 3 times, lifting every scarf, opening the little boxes where I kept brooches and spare buttons. I checked the safe, the jewelry dish in the bathroom, even the sewing basket in the hall closet. It wasn't there. There were only 2 people who had been in the house since I last wore it: Emily and the home nurse who stopped by from the hospital for a quick post-fall visit. The nurse had no reason to go upstairs. Emily had brought casserole and mortgage documents and left shortly after. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. I just went to the pawn shop. There's one a few miles from town, tucked between a defunct diner and an auto parts store. I hadn't been in there in years, not since Henry and I went looking for an old watch battery he insisted on replacing himself. The man behind the counter remembered me. I told him I was looking for a pendant, described it, and asked if anyone had brought one in recently. He hesitated, then pulled out a tray. There it was. Not mine. A replica. The stone was cheaper, the setting not quite right, but the design was close enough. I knew instantly it was a copy. "She said it was a family piece," he told me, tapping the glass. Showed me an old photo as proof. I bought the replica. At home, I placed it back in the velvet pouch and returned it to the drawer. Let her think I hadn't noticed. Let her think I'd accepted her story, if she ever gave one. She wanted me in the drama. I would not give her the satisfaction. Instead, I turned my attention to smaller, quieter things. I called Connie again, this time about the will. The trust was settled, but the house wasn't. It had always been left to Aaron in the event of my death. That, I decided, needed changing too. I had the deed revised. The house would pass to no one. It would be sold upon my death, the profits split between Laura and a women's legal aid foundation Henry and I had once donated to in a better year. Aaron's name was removed entirely. The call started on Monday. Aaron first. I didn't answer. Then texts. First polite, "Just checking in, Mom," then concerned, "We're worried about you," then persistent. I left them unread. By Tuesday, Emily tried calling. Her name flashed across the screen 3 times in a row. I let it go to voicemail each time. Then Aaron again. "We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding." By Thursday, the tone changed. You can't just disappear from your family. You raised me better than this. It was strange, reading those words from someone who'd said don't come back just 2 weeks ago. The shift was clear. They had discovered the missing mortgage signature. Maybe they'd heard from the bank. Maybe Laura had said something. Either way, they knew something had changed. I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said it, in my actions, in the documents, in the silence I now chose for myself. Late Thursday evening, another call came in. From a number I didn't recognize. I let it go. A minute later, a text followed. Found your pendant. Emily swears she was holding it for safekeeping. She's sorry. No mention of when or where it had been found. No explanation for how it left my drawer and ended up wherever it had. I didn't respond. I went to the cupboard and pulled down the good dishes, porcelain with faded blue trim that we'd used every Easter until Henry passed. I washed each one, dried them carefully, and lined them back on the shelf in perfect stacks. The next day, I went to the garden center and bought soil, gloves, and 3 trays of begonias. Laura stopped by that afternoon and helped me plant them. She didn't ask questions. She didn't bring up her sister or the messages she'd sent. We planted in silence, the kind that feels like shared understanding, not avoidance. After we finished, we sat on the porch with lemonade. The breeze was mild. The marsh was quiet. You don't have to say anything, she said. I know, I replied. A few days later, the final document arrived from the law office confirming the updated will. I placed it in the safe beside the trust paperwork, behind the insurance documents and medical directives. I made a list for Connie, typed it, and mailed a copy. The phone calls came less often after that. The texts slowed, then stopped. On Easter Sunday, Aaron showed up. I saw his car pull into the driveway and almost didn't go to the door. But I opened it. Slowly. Calmly. He looked tired. Thinner. He held his hands awkwardly, like he didn't know what to do with them. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. He stood in the hallway, the same one he used to run down with socks sliding on the floor. He looked smaller somehow, or maybe I was just seeing him more clearly. I'm sorry, he said. For all of it. For letting things happen that shouldn't have. For not asking questions when I should have. For not listening. I nodded but didn't say anything. I've started seeing someone, he continued. A therapist. It was Laura who encouraged it. That surprised me, but I didn't show it. She told me everything. I mean, everything she knew. The fake pregnancy. The mortgage. The pendant. I don't know what else Emily's done. But I know it's not right. I'm filing for divorce. There it was. The sentence I never thought I'd hear. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were wet. I know it doesn't fix anything, he said. But I had to come. I had to say it. I nodded again. Can I sit? He asked. We sat in the living room. I poured tea. He drank it in silence. No rush, no pressure to be forgiven. Later that afternoon, he stood in front of the whole family, what was left of it, and told the truth. At Easter lunch, in Laura's backyard, beneath a tent they'd put up to keep the sun off the deviled eggs and fruit salad, Aaron told them everything. He didn't defend himself. He didn't excuse Emily. He just spoke plainly. No victory settled in me that day. No feeling of triumph. What came instead was a kind of stillness. Aaron left quietly. Said he'd call next week. I told him he could. 2 days later, the real pendant arrived in a plain envelope, no note inside. I put it back in its pouch, placed it high on a closet shelf, and closed the door. That evening, Laura came over to help water the begonias. The air between us was easy, familiar. We worked in companionable silence, the kind that doesn't ask questions or demand apologies. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I wanted space. I wanted quiet. I had both now. And more importantly, I had something I hadn't felt in years, myself, whole, unshaken, and finally, quietly untouchable. The week after Easter passed without a word from Emily. No messages. No calls. She didn't ask for the pendant back, and I didn't offer. As far as I was concerned, that chapter had closed. Whatever story she'd been telling herself, or Aaron, or the people around her, it had finally unraveled. And I wasn't going to sew it back together for her. Aaron called the following Tuesday, as he said he would. The conversation was short, practical. He said he'd filed the paperwork and was moving out of the lake house at the end of the month. He was staying with a friend for now and had already scheduled another therapy appointment. I know I've got a lot of work to do, he said. Not just to understand what happened with Emily, but with myself. With us. I told him I appreciated the call. I didn't offer comfort or judgment. Just quiet acknowledgement. That was all either of us had to give. That evening, I sat down and wrote a new letter. Not to Aaron, and not to Emily. This one was to myself. I didn't do anything with it, just folded it, placed it in the drawer beside my nightstand, and left it there. It said, among other things. You were not wrong for being generous. You were not foolish for trusting. But now, you know better. Now, you trust yourself more. That small sentence, you trust yourself more, stayed with me. Because that had always been the piece missing. I had trusted Aaron. I had trusted Henry. I had trusted that if I showed up, if I worked hard, if I put my family first, I would be seen and loved in return. But what I hadn't done, what no one ever taught me to do, was trust myself to say no. To say enough. To say not this time. Laura started coming by more often. Not with any big purpose. Sometimes we sat on the porch and talked about things that had nothing to do with family. She brought over books, garden clippings, once a lemon cake that didn't quite set in the middle, but we ate it anyway. There was something easy about her company, maybe because she didn't expect anything from me. She didn't try to make me feel useful. She just let me be. In May, I met with Connie again. I'd decided to leave the house as a donation to the women's shelter when I passed. Not out of spite. Not to take anything from Aaron. But because I wanted the life Henry and I built to mean something beyond the narrow bounds of inheritance. Aaron still had the option, through the trust, to claim his share, if he followed through on everything we'd set in motion. And I left it that way. Whether he did or didn't was his to decide. The day the azaleas bloomed, I walked out to the garden before breakfast and stood there for a long time, just taking it in. The air was soft. The marsh behind the house shimmered, silver and green under the rising sun. That view had comforted me through grief, through storms, through long stretches of loneliness. It had been my witness. And now, standing there with my wrist healed and my name clear on every document that mattered, I felt more like myself than I had in years. That's the part no one talks about, what happens after the fire dies down. Not the drama, not the confession, not the divorce papers or the revised will. The part where you quietly return to your life. Rearrange the cabinets. Change the sheets. Let your breath come fully into your chest again. That's the real victory. One afternoon in early June, I took out a small box from the back of the linen closet. Inside were photographs I hadn't looked at in a long time, some from when Aaron was a boy, others from before he was born. Henry with his hand on my shoulder, smiling in that unassuming way he had. Not proud, not flashy, just present. I remembered something he once said to me, long ago, when Aaron was 10 and I was working double shifts to make ends meet. I had come home exhausted, dinner still to make, laundry still waiting. "You're not just keeping things afloat," he said. "You're building a whole life." At the time, I shrugged it off. Thought he was just trying to make me feel better. But now, years later, I finally believed it. I wasn't surviving. I was shaping something. Even now, even in the quiet. In early July, I got a call from the bank. The final disbursement had been processed. The amended trust was in effect. Aaron had followed through, he'd ended the marriage, submitted all the required documentation, and waived any future claim to joint property with Emily. They asked where the new beneficiary funds should be sent. I gave them the information for Laura. That evening, I invited her over for dinner. Nothing fancy. Just roast chicken, some roasted carrots, and a lemon pie I'd made with a store-bought crust. We sat on the porch after, watching the fireflies blink through the trees. She didn't mention the money. I didn't either. But I saw the change in her. She sat taller. More sure of herself. Maybe because she'd spoken up when it mattered. Maybe because someone had finally seen her as worth the risk. When she left, she gave me a hug, not one of those polite, half-hearted ones people do at the door, but the kind that means something. "You're good at this," she said. "Living on your own." I smiled. I had good training. The rest of the summer passed gently. I kept up the garden. Read in the afternoons. Took long walks when the air cooled in the evening. I wasn't waiting for anything. I wasn't avoiding anything either. I was simply living. On the first cool day of September, I found the envelope Aaron had sent me in July. I tucked it away without reading it. At the time, I didn't trust that I was ready. But now, I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in his familiar, steady handwriting. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He told me he'd been blind to more than just Emily, that he'd coasted for too long on the comfort of knowing I'd always be there. That somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing me as a person. He wrote, "You didn't teach me that. I learned it from the world. But I'm unlearning it now. Slowly. And if I ever earn the right, I hope to be allowed back into your life. Not as your son who expects, but as your son who finally understands." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside the one I'd written to myself. We weren't there yet. But maybe we would be. And that was enough. In the quiet of the house, I walked through the rooms, touching the things I had chosen. The curtains, the photographs, the well-worn doorknobs. Everything I had once thought I might lose had returned to me, not the things themselves, but the peace that came from knowing I didn't need permission to keep them. The pendant stayed tucked away, high on the shelf where it belonged. The documents were filed. The decisions were made. And I, for the first time in years, was free. The first real rain came in October. Not a storm, not a sudden squall like the ones we used to get in late spring, just a steady fall, slow and even, like the ground had been waiting for it. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the water gather on the stone path that Henry had laid one summer when he thought retirement would be filled with landscaping projects and morning coffee under the pergola. He never made it to retirement, of course. The stroke had taken him just shy of 62, and the path he'd laid became mine to maintain. I remember thinking, during those first quiet days after his death, that maybe I'd rip it out. That it was his project, not mine. But I never did. Somehow, it became part of the structure of things. Like the porch railings or the shape of the flower beds. His hands had touched it. That mattered. The rain fell through lunchtime, softening everything. I opened the front door just to smell it. The wood of the porch steps had that damp cedar scent, and somewhere down by the marsh, the the frogs had started up early. It reminded me of evenings long ago, Aaron splashing in puddles, his shoes ruined, his face lit up like the whole world was made for him. He used to beg for warm baths after those afternoons. I'd wrap him in towels and sit on the edge of the tub, listening to his stories. That boy, the one who used to run through the rain barefoot, was still in there somewhere. I saw glimpses of him in Aaron's letter, in his voice on the phone. He hadn't asked to come visit again, and I hadn't offered. There was no schedule, no plan. Just space. And for the first time, I realized how much I valued that space. For so many years, I had confused proximity with closeness. I thought being involved, being needed, was the same as being loved. That if I wasn't providing something, money, meals, advice, I wouldn't have a place at the table. I know now that was fear talking. Fear, and habit, and all the invisible messages I'd swallowed about what made a mother good. There's a freedom in realizing you can be loved without being used. And if you're not, then maybe that love was never real. A few days after the rain, I received a small envelope in the mail. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, tight, slanted. Inside was a note from Patricia Meek's son, the one Laura had mentioned back when we talked about the Spanish property and Henry's careful instructions. I heard about what you did for Laura, it read. Whatever your reasons, thank you. My mother didn't always get what she gave, but it sounds like your husband made sure you would. That matters. There was no return address. Just a signature and a short line at the bottom. People remember more than you think. I didn't know what prompted him to write. Maybe Laura had told him about the revised trust, or about the quiet way I'd moved my life back into my own hands. Maybe he'd heard that Emily was out of the picture. Or maybe it was nothing more than the odd timing of old threads pulling tight again. Still, I kept the letter. It felt like a marker of something, not validation, exactly, but recognition. That same week, I received a call from the shelter director who'd handled the paperwork for the house's future donation. Her voice was warm and efficient, the way I imagine mine used to sound when I worked at the front desk of the elementary school. I just wanted to thank you again, she said. It's not every day we get a call like yours. Most people don't think about this kind of legacy until very late, if at all. I told her it wasn't a legacy I'd planned. It was one I'd earned. She paused for a second. That's a good way of putting it. After we hung up, I sat on the porch and looked out at the trees. The leaves had started to shift, reds and oranges creeping in from the edges. I thought about all the women who'd live in this house someday, long after I was gone. I imagined them walking barefoot across the same kitchen tiles, opening the same windows, watching the same marsh light change with the seasons. Maybe one of them would find the photograph I'd left tucked behind the pantry door, Henry and me, sitting on the porch in the fall, his arms slung casually over the back of my chair, our faces turned toward each other instead of the camera. I'd written nothing on the back. No names, no dates. Just let it be what it was. By November, Laura had started coming over every Thursday for supper. It wasn't anything official. Sometimes she brought soup. Sometimes I cooked. We didn't plan it, it just became what we did. She told me about her work, her garden, a man she'd met through her church who was too nice to be interesting but too interesting to ignore. I listened. I didn't offer advice unless she asked. One evening, she told me that Aaron had reached out to her again. Just to say thank you. Nothing more. He's quieter now, she said, stirring her tea. Not as sure of himself. I nodded. That's not always a bad thing. No, she agreed. It's not. We didn't talk about Emily anymore. That story was over. In the second week of December, I finally took down the last box of Henry's things from the attic. I'd left it there too long, more out of habit than sentiment. Inside were some of his old notebooks, a few shirts, and the small wooden boat he'd carved for Aaron when he was 6. The paint had chipped, the string on the sail was frayed, but I didn't throw it away. I cleaned it gently and placed it on the shelf in the living room. That evening, I lit a fire and sat near it with a book I'd been meaning to finish for years. The flames flickered low. Outside, the wind picked up. I listened to the sounds of the house, settling wood, the tick of the thermostat, the distant hum of something alive in the marsh. I realized, sitting there, that this was what Henry meant all those years ago. You're not just keeping things afloat. You're building a life. And now, finally, I was living in it. The phone rang once that night. Aaron again. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. I was all right with that. Some conversations could wait. Some didn't need to happen at all. The next morning, I folded laundry and rearranged the linens in the hallway. I cleaned out the junk drawer in the kitchen. I made soup from what was left in the fridge and sat down to eat it at the table by the window, where the light hit just right around noon. Everything was quiet. But this time, it wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from being left behind. It was the kind you earn after everything unnecessary has fallen away. The kind that fills a house, rather than empties it. The kind that tells you, without saying a word, that you have done enough. That you are enough. And that you are home. The week before Christmas, I pulled the old wreath from the hall closet and hung it on the front door. The bough had faded, the berries were loose in their sockets, and one pinecone hung by a thread, but it still smelled faintly of cinnamon. I'd used that wreath every December since Henry brought it home from the craft fair downtown, the year Aaron was 15 and too busy for tree decorating. That had been the first year I felt the tug of change, the slow pull of motherhood slipping into the background. But even then, even in the shifting, I never imagined I'd one day hang the wreath for myself alone. That I would listen to carols with no one humming along out of tune. That I would light a candle at the window and not expect anyone to come up the path. And yet, that's what I did. I made myself cocoa. I turned on the small radio in the kitchen. I reheated leftover stew and watched the wind move through the marsh grasses like it had somewhere to be. There was no sadness in it, not anymore. Just a kind of knowing. A recognition that stillness wasn't the same as loneliness. That I had earned this season, and I would sit with it, without apology. That same night, Aaron sent a card. It came in a plain envelope, addressed in his handwriting. No return address. No message inside beyond a short line. Thinking of you this week. Hoping you're warm and well. Aaron. There was no mention of Christmas. No request for forgiveness or invitations. Just a quiet note, folded neatly, like a peace offering without demand. I set it on the mantel next to the candlesticks Henry's mother had given us on our first anniversary. The brass was dull with age, and I hadn't polished them in years, but I didn't mind. Things could be imperfect and still hold value. On Christmas morning, I woke before the sun, just as I always had. Years ago, I'd rise early to set out presents, warm the cinnamon rolls, check the roast in the fridge. Now there was no rush. No giggling from down the hall, no stocking lids pulled back to peek at what waited. I sat with my coffee, warm in both hands, and let the quiet settle around me. I thought about how holidays used to mean fullness, of noise, of people, of expectation. And how now, I found peace in the opposite. In having nothing I needed to manage. No one I needed to perform for. Around 9, Laura arrived. She didn't knock, just stepped inside the way people do when they know they're welcome. She wore an old sweater and boots still damp from the walk up my drive. I brought scones, she said, lifting a tin. They're dry, but that's how I like them. We sat in the kitchen. The stove clicked gently, the radio played carols without commercials, and the scones weren't dry at all. I poured tea, she spooned jam, and we didn't speak much. It was the kind of silence that had nothing to prove. "I called my sister last week," she said finally. She answered. Didn't say much. Just cried a little and then hung up. I nodded. "That sounds about right." "I'm not angry anymore," she added. "Not exactly. I just don't want her near me." "That's fair." She looked at me then, eyes clearer than they'd been in months. "I keep thinking I'm supposed to be the bigger person. That if I hold on to the bitterness, I'm just hurting myself." "That's something people say when they don't want to be uncomfortable," I told her. "But some pain isn't yours to soothe. Some people don't get access just because they feel bad." She smiled, not wide, but true. "Thank you." We washed the teacups together. She left by 10, promising to stop by next week with her new neighbor's lemon cake recipe. After she left, I went out to the garden. Everything was still, brown and sleeping. The earth hadn't frozen over yet, but the cold was settled in deep. The roses were pruned back, the herb garden was quiet. Even the wind moved carefully between the trees. I stood at the gate and thought about all the versions of myself that had lived on that soil. The young wife planting basil in a sundress, the new mother with Aaron swaddled against her chest, the widow who hadn't yet cried, the mother waiting for a visit that wouldn't come. I had been all of them. And now, I was someone else. Not newer. Not stronger. Just more settled into herself. That evening, I roasted a small chicken, sliced 2 potatoes, and ate by candlelight. Not because it was romantic or ceremonial. Just because it was quiet. Just because it felt good to sit with something warm. A week later, I met with Connie for the final time that year. We reviewed the trust, the revised deed, the allocation of funds. Everything was in place. "I'm glad you came to me when you did," she said, tapping her pen against the folder. "This could have gone very differently." "I know," I said. "That's why I waited." She tilted her head. "Waited?" "To act," I clarified. "I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand anything. I waited. Paid attention. Let the story tell itself." She gave a small, approving nod. "That's rare." I shrugged. "It's just a skill you develop after enough birthdays where you're the one who makes the cake, slices it, and cleans up afterward." We shared a smile. By the time I got home, a light snow had begun to fall. The kind that doesn't stick, just dances for a while in the air before vanishing. I stood on the porch and let it settle on my coat. A few flakes caught in the folds of my scarf. Everything felt suspended, like a held breath. My phone buzzed. A photo from Aaron. It was of a bookshelf. One I recognized from his childhood bedroom, now freshly sanded and restained. The caption read, "Took your advice. Built something instead of buying it." I looked at the photo for a long time. Then I turned off the phone and placed it on the table inside. I didn't need to reply right away. Some things are better left unanswered for a while, not out of spite, but out of respect for the silence. That night, I dreamed of the house in Spain. I hadn't thought about it in months. Not since the paperwork settled. But in the dream, I was there. The shutters were open. The light came in warm and golden, and the air smelled of rosemary and salt. I sat at the small kitchen table, the sea visible just beyond the terrace. No one else was there. Not Aaron. Not Emily. Not even Laura. Just me. And I was smiling. I woke without sadness, the image still clear behind my eyes. Maybe one day I'd go there. Maybe not. But it was mine. And the knowing of that, the sheer fact of ownership, not of property, but of peace, was enough. Later that morning, I returned to the garden and cut the last of the winter rosemary, tied it with twine, and hung it by the kitchen window. Its scent filled the room slowly, gently. No need to rush. This was a season of softness. Of quiet power. And I had stepped fully into it.